I know I'm a real outlier in terms of what I'm going to talk about here. I've learned so much in the last few days. I'm going to talk about you and I, because we're the people that live on this planet. I'm going to talk about our mental health, and I'm going to talk about our children's mental health. I want to thank Amy for the invitation. I'm a part-time resident in Sun Valley, and I just really appreciate bringing a mental health perspective to the conversation. As the senator said, I'm with the University of Minnesota, and what we do there, we're a member of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, which was funded in 2000 during the Clinton administration, the mission of which is to provide quality care to children, families, and communities who have been traumatized. So it started with 17 networks, centers. There are now about 180. And sadly, that's due to 9/11, when people really began to understand the importance of mental health and trauma-trained clinicians, and therefore the funding just really took off. So our center has been funded since 2005. When I first was told I had the opportunity to speak, I started looking up resilience in the literature. And I realized it's such a broad term: climate, birds, forests, trees, the banking system, railway system. My interest is not that, although I love our planet and I've learned a lot. My interest is mental health, more specifically children's mental health, and even more narrowly than that, child traumatic stress. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes. I'm going to give you an overview, the importance of understanding it, and then I'm going to talk about really wonderful solutions to implement in the community. So there are 3 levels of stress. The first level is positive stress. How many of you were here yesterday afternoon when the dog ran across the stage? A couple people. So in the middle of a gentleman's presentation, a dog went running across the room and across the stage. And a woman was frantically chasing the dog. And she got right in the middle of all of us, and she looked up at us, and she said, "This is the worst day of my life." And then she continued on to catch her dog. So that's an example of positive stress. Her heart rate was pumping, the adrenaline was flowing, but when she got out the door and she got her dog, she was back to a normal state. She was fine, and it motivated her to hurry up and get her dog. The second level of stress is called tolerable stress, a good accident. I've been in many, many car accidents, as my daughter, who is in the audience, knows. In fact, she's been in the car a couple times when it's happened, unfortunately. And some of those accidents have been bad, but nobody has ever been hurt. I come out of those very, very shaken. And my heart is beating quickly, adrenaline is flowing, and it takes me a day or two to settle down. I do have resources, though, and that makes a big difference. I have car insurance, I have a good mechanic, I have the resources to replace the car. That's tolerable stress. The kind of stress I'm going to talk about is toxic stress. Toxic stress happens to people when bad things happen to them. And I think all of you here, including myself, either know people or we've been in situations where bad things have happened. Toxic stress is when those bad things occur over a longer period of time. So domestic violence is a good example. Children who witness that usually begin to develop traumatic, toxic stress. And it puts their body in a high state of alert, which is great because it helps them to survive. The downside is when it's continual like that, their body doesn't go back to normal state. So these are the kids that will be in the classroom. They've come from home. They witness the violence that may go on. They come into the classroom. The teacher walks up to them, very pleasant person, says something nice, and they just fly off the handle because they're always ready for danger. So toxic stress, I'll call it child traumatic stress from this point forward. 1976, Chowchilla, California. You may know about this because I think it's been popularized in TV series, but a woman, doctor, psychiatrist named Lenore Tier wrote a book called Too Scared to Cry. And I would encourage you, if you're interested in this kind of stuff, to read the book. It's great. So 26 kids were in a school bus. They were coming home from summer school, ages 5 to 14. The bus was hijacked. The kids were put in a vehicle. They were driven around for about 100 miles. And then they were placed in the bed of a truck that was buried in the ground. They were covered up, and 2 100-pound weights were put on the cover of the truck. So they were buried for 16 hours. Meanwhile, their parents all knew something was wrong, but they didn't know what it was. So thanks to the ingenuity of the bus driver, 16 hours later, they all got out. They were returned home safely. How many of you think they lived happily ever after? No, they didn't. One of the families had the foresight to call in a psychiatrist because what they realized was it was their daughter. She wasn't the same person that left the house that morning when she returned. She was a different kid, and it took them a while, but they began to figure out something was really wrong. Thanks to Dr. Tier, she really discovered and documented what happens to children when they've been in a stressful, toxic situation. And she found that the kids in the other families that would agree to talk to her were in exactly the same situation. The outcomes for these kids, not great. One of them ended up committing a murder, a Japanese tourist, because he thought the tourist was going to attack him, when in fact that never would have happened. A couple of them ended up in prison, and several went through their adult life with serious depression, anxiety, and fear. That was a seminal piece of work that began to document child traumatic stress. Since then, there's been 40 years worth of research. There's no question that it alters the brain, which alters behavior. And since that time, and more recently, people are really looking at the interaction between the environment and genetics, and they're even going down the road of epigenetics, which is changing the genes so that the offspring of adults with trauma don't pass that on to their children. 1985, Dr. Andrew Folletti was running an obesity group for Kaiser Permanente, the health insurance company out of California. And what he noticed with the obesity group was that as people began to lose weight, they also started dropping out of the group before it was completed. And he was curious. He began to wonder why. And so he started interviewing these people. And what he found out was that many of them had been physically and sexually abused as children. And when they started losing weight, they really had fear, depression, anxiety, because they recognized that their weight was a shield, kind of an armor that protected them against another possible attack. And when they lost weight, they started to feel really vulnerable, so they started putting the weight back on. He coupled up with the Center for Disease Control, and in 1985, he did a study of 17,000 people. Now, these people are people like you and I. They aren't down and outers. These 17,000 people all had health insurance. So they were probably middle to upper income. He asked them 10 questions. 5 of the questions were about bad things that had happened to them in their childhood. 5 questions were about bad things that had happened in their home. what he discovered was 2/3 of the 17,000 people had at least one, he calls them adverse childhood experiences growing up. 20% had 3 or more. And those that had up to 6, he found, died on average 20 years earlier. They didn't die because of the adverse experiences. They died because as their score, these are called ACE questions, as their score on the questions went up, so did their risk for these kinds of behaviors: smoking, obesity, alcohol, all negative ways of coping when bad things happened. And so the important thing about this study is just the impact of trauma on mental health and physical health. Why is this important? 34% of all children in the US have experienced at least one traumatic event. 25% between the ages of 9 and 16 have experienced at least one. The other reason it's so important is it costs all of us a lot of money. These are often people that eventually end up homeless. They end up in prison. They end up in our juvenile correctional facilities. They fill up our courts. So it's very costly. So what exactly is trauma? I'm going to skip this in the interest of time and go with this definition from the National Institute of Mental Health. Trauma, child trauma, is the experience of an event by a child that the child perceives to be a threat to life and limb, and which has often lasting mental and physical effects. This is kind of the short list of traumatic events, and normally when I talk about this, I'm talking to child protection workers, educators, juvenile justice workers. So physical and sexual, emotional abuse, domestic violence, abandonment, neglect are usually at the top. But because of all the violence that's going on, and because I know it's on all of our minds, community violence is considered a traumatic event. I'm from St. Paul, Minnesota, and St. Paul has been in the news, unfortunately, because of the police officer who shot a gentleman, African-American man, in a car. He bled to death in the car. Next to him was his girlfriend, who I guarantee you will suffer from trauma if she doesn't get help. But what I'm concerned about is the 4-year-old in the back seat of that car who saw the whole thing and who people will tend maybe to write off and go, well, she'll forget about it, she'll be fine. No, the fact of the matter is she won't be. So in a community such as this, we all can relate to community violence, and certainly we can all relate to natural disasters, if not present, but in the future, just kind of based on what we've heard in the last couple days. So now shifting to resilience, and I'll go through this quickly. In my world, the world of mental health, resilience means a pattern of positive adaptation against a backdrop of adversity. The way for me to think about it, and I didn't say this, someone else did, I wish I could remember who. When something bad happens to you, you can let it destroy you, you can let it define you, or you can let it strengthen you. So I want to talk about resilience on just 2 levels, the individual level and the community level. And I want to read you a case study. Following their parents' divorce, a 3-year-old African-American girl and her 4-year-old brother traveled alone by train to live with their grandmother in Arkansas. 4 years later, their father arrived without warning, and he moved the children to live with their biological mother in Missouri. At age 8, the child was brutally raped by the mother's boyfriend, and that guy was eventually shot by the child's uncle. In the aftermath of that trauma, the child became mute for almost 5 years. Eventually, she was sent back to live with her grandmother, sent again to live with her mother. By the time she was 17, she was pregnant. and she started sliding into poverty and criminal activity. She didn't have an education. She was trying to raise a son. So given all the exposure she had to psychosocial risks and struggles to adapt during her early life, one would not have predicted that she would someday become a world-renowned writer, poet, performer, and influential voice in American civil rights. So what she credits her resilience to is, first of all, a teacher who taught her to speak again and gave her a great love of books, her grandmother who represented financial stability in her life to some degree, and the African American community, because it gave her an opportunity to get involved in the civil rights movement. So individual resilience this is the short list. It's about relationships first and foremost. If not a parent, a caregiver, a grandmother, an auntie, somebody who cares for the kid. If not a caregiver, a teacher, some community member, a religious group. So some way to surround that person with relationships. Second on the short list is cognitive abilities. It really makes a difference if someone has some cognitive abilities versus someone who's disabled. Socioeconomic status absolutely plays into it. There is such a strong link in the research between poverty and toxic stress. And one great example is a study that was done comparing kids who were maltreated, physical and sexual abuse, to kids who were never maltreated but lived below the poverty level. Their levels of toxic stress were exactly the same. And then finally, effective institutions in the communities like schools. Just say a word about parenting. I don't know if you can read that. Just take a second. That's really called stress parenting. And a lot of us, I think, at least I'll speak for myself, probably grew up with a little of that. You do it because I said so. But stress parenting isn't really effective over the long term, and it's particularly not effective when children face adversity. So in terms of resilience, good parenting skills can be learned, and they can be learned by anybody, the most educated to the most uneducated. Now I want to shift to the community level. And by the way, I should say at the University of Minnesota, we do a lot of parenting, teaching, and coaching to families, and in this case, who have experienced PTSD because of war. Trauma-informed schools, it's something else we do at the university. We work to create trauma-informed communities. Trauma-informed schools are popping up all over the US. There's a really specific process to use to help a school become trauma-informed. The goal is not to improve outcomes for kids when we're helping a school to become trauma-informed. Our goal is to help the teachers and the educators deal with kids in their classroom who have experienced traumatic events. They're the ones that are going to improve outcomes for the kids. And then on a bigger scale, trauma-informed communities. So Philadelphia, for example, is launching an initiative right now to develop a trauma-informed school. Tarpon Springs, Florida has been into it for a long time. Walla Walla, Washington is really a leader in it. In Minnesota, we did it in 5 regions of our state with greater and lesser success. But that's another example where there's a very specific implementation strategy, and when we use it, we get good results. So individuals, communities, institutions can really benefit and can become resilient, but it's so important that we recognize who these kids are. We promote it by talking about screening and the need to screen kids, and the work I do, we developed a 5-question screener that works well to determine which kids are going to need help that have been through bad things and which kids are not. And I just want to, so I want to close by telling you about a personal experience and thanking the Wood River Valley community. I'm a part-time resident here, been coming here with my kids for 25 to 30 years, and my husband died here suddenly. And I was here alone with him. My kids were working and doing their thing in other states. And when he died, I got the phone call from a friend here. I was told to go to the hospital. I knew what the story was going to be when I got there. I got to the hospital, and I was surrounded by friends and members of this community. They took me home when I did everything I had to do there. They stayed with me until late at night, brought in food, we drank, we told stories. One of them slept over on my couch that night, would not leave me alone. I flew out the next day, and one, who happens to be here, would not let me drive to Boise, which is where I always fly in and out of, by myself. So to me, this is an example of a very supportive community and how the community just comes out together when bad things happen to people. Thank you very much.